Okay, let's react to some Eastery, okay? We need some content for the second channel, boys. Second channel's dying. I'm joking, it's not. It's doing really well. All right, Eastery. Second Sino-Japanese War. This was before the official beginning of World War II.
Why did Japan attack the United States of America during World War II? The United States had a much stronger economy and Japan did not have many chances of winning. The answer lies in the Second Sino-Japanese War. It all began 10 years ago. China had been in relative stagnation for a long time, while Japan had started its modernization half a century ago and had a strong military. This had allowed Japan to make some expansion. Seeing China in a weak state, the Japanese military decided to continue with enlarging Japan's territory and occupied the Chinese province of Manchuria. China did not have a strong army and could not offer much resistance. The Japanese proceeded with expansion and took over Chinese territories bit by bit. In 1937, the Japanese seized some Chinese cities. By that time,
I feel like I need to know a little bit more here. Like, what do you qualify as not a very large army? Because that didn't stay that way, did it? Because in 1939, in this war particularly, this is where China ramped up its military massively. What was going on internally in China at the time that caused them to have such a small military to make them just fall over to Japan?
The Chinese public had become outraged by Japanese expansion and demanded resistance. The Chinese military was too weak to recapture the territories. The Chinese decided to capture the weakly defended Japanese possession in Shanghai. Then they could possibly trade it back to Japan for the return of the territories in the north.
This was actually the legitimate strategy. They were going to hand over their own territory internally so they can get back Beijing. What?
Chinese attacked in Shanghai. They expected to finish the operation quickly, but they were unable to overcome the Japanese defenses. Both sides brought reinforcements and the fighting grew larger. Japan wanted to end the conflict by inflicting a major defeat on China. It deployed 200,000 men in North China to go on offensive and destroy the Chinese forces. The Chinese knew of their weakness. They did not allow themselves to be drawn in a decisive battle and offered major...
One thing from playing Hoi 4 that you realize, this northern area of China here, right this point, is just plains. So this is like perfect encirclement territory. So you've got the mountains here where Commie China is. And then here, there's some big major rivers in this northern region. So if you make an encirclement right here, this is the sweet spot. That's where all the big encirclements are.
Major resistance only in the western mountains. Japan was unable to destroy the Chinese forces, but it still could do so in Shanghai. Japan landed around 300,000 men in Shanghai and went on a counterattack.
300,000? Holy shit.
The Chinese made a mistake by holding Shanghai for as long as possible, and the Japanese landed another force behind their lines. The Chinese were unable to properly react to the landings, and their forces were thrown into disarray. Without encountering much resistance, the Japanese now headed towards the Chinese capital at Nanjing. The Japanese captured it, and a large part of the city's civilian population perished in the following weeks during the Nanjing massacre.
Damn.
Japan had inflicted a major defeat on China and now offered peace on harsh terms. Although the Japanese military had proven to be stronger than the Chinese, Japan had other weaknesses. It was a much smaller country than China and had difficulties sustaining a large army. Also, Japan was threatened by other powers, and if they would move against Japan, it would find itself in great difficulties.
This is a big question, isn't it? If they didn't have to worry about the Soviet Union north of them, or worry about a USA embargo of their fuel, how much extra war capacity could they put into the Chinese war? That's a big question, isn't it? Because there's always that thought at the back of the mind for the Japanese, what if they invade Manchuria from the north? Because in that case, they're completely fucked, aren't they? And then if they lose fuel from America, they're going to be in a situation where their momentum in China is going to be more limited as well. No planes, no tanks, no motorized. Just walking, boys. Horses.
Expected Japan to become weaker as time passed.
China war.
And it decided not to make peace with Japan for as long as possible.
So this was a change to their strategy. Before, they were always making concessions, losing Manchuria, losing Inner Mongolia, losing Beijing. They were always making concessions to the Japanese so they would not result in full-blown war. But this was the point where they were like, no, we're not actually going to surrender. There's no concessions going to be made. This is going to be total war.
Japan could not force China to surrender, so it decided to neutralize it by attacking.
The Soviets and Japan signed a non-aggression pact before Pearl Harbor. Tell me about the Soviet-German non-aggression pact. Let me know how that went.
Attacking China's economy. The Chinese war industry and its best agricultural lands were in the central part of the country. Japan believed that if it occupied them, then the Chinese army would become much weaker. Then Japan would not need to sustain a large force in China and could reduce its garrison. The Japanese
This is one area, I think, in Hoi 4 that it's not represented very well. When you push into China and you limit their divisions and weaken them and take off out most of their factories and most of their divisions, China can never fucking recover. They can't recover. And I feel like it really is disappointing in a way because it doesn't represent China how they fought during this specific war. It'd be nice if, you know, as you were getting pushed into inland by the Japanese, that more of your factories would relocate to the center, so therefore you still had that fighting capabilities. But in China, in Japan, in Hoi 4, it tends to be that when you lose, it's like a snowball. You like lose, more lose. There's never a point where it's like too much for the attacker. You know what I mean?
First wanted to connect their armies in the north and south of China.
Or there could have been a way that they could have made resistance. That's a good thing. I've never played Japan since La Resistance. So that means I've never had to handle the resistance of China. It'd be kind of cool if there was events inside of China that would make resistance pop up over and over again. So it really would be the thorn in your side. It'd be stressing your military economy to keep pushing in.
While most of their armies were reorganizing, they
aren't there divisions to relocate the Chinese factories? I don't think so, but it's been a long time since I played China.
Launched the attack with weaker forces. In the south, the Chinese brought up reinforcements and stopped the Japanese on a river line. Then they regrouped their units in the north and deployed a strong force against the Japanese northern attack, which halted their offensive.
Yeah, one thing I've noticed about No Step Back is that in central China, western China, whatever you want to call it, there's only one supply dump really far away from the final capital. Is it Chongqing? Is it? I can't remember. But it's the further western capital that China gets, and the supply dumps are so far away. You reach a point where you're stuck against the rivers and you can't push anymore.
This left a lot of Chinese troops situated between the two Japanese armies, and Japan set out to encircle them. The Chinese were ready for that and withdrew their forces from the encirclement. The Japanese then continued to advance west. But the Chinese destroyed the dikes on the Yellow River, which flooded the area between the two armies, and the Japanese had to stop their advance. The Japanese now set out to capture the lands around the Yangtze River and the city of Wuhan. The floods closed the northern route.
Isn't there a decision that allows you in Hoi 4 to do that flood? Because I heard it had mixed results.
And the Japanese chose to advance along the Yangtze River.
Japanese.
The Chinese
Wuhan
had 800,000 men.
Why have I heard of that place
While the Japanese attacking force had only 200,000. The Chinese deployed their troops on the path of the Japanese attack and slowed.
Look at the terrain here. Look at all these lakes and rivers. This is very difficult terrain to occupy.
Down their advance. The Japanese then attacked the weak Chinese forces in the north and outflanked the Chinese defenses. This helped the Japanese to overcome the Chinese on the Yangtze, and they now approached Wuhan. The Chinese abandoned the city to the enemy. The Japanese proceeded with securing their position. They expanded their territory to the east and west. Then they set out to destroy the Chinese armies. They dispersed the Chinese forces in the north and returned to their positions.
Wow, they made an encirclement and then they backed out of it. Hoi 4 strats, boys.
They then launched an attack against the Chinese in the south.
Repeat encirclement over and over and over again until they got no divisions left.
Japan had achieved its goal of occupying the Chinese war industry. In order to prevent China circumventing the Japanese strategy by buying war materials from overseas.
Yeah, this capital, is this pronounced Chongqing? That's Qing. Chongqing, yeah. This is the one that I feel like in Hoi 4, it's really far away from a supply depot. So when you reach this point here, it's really difficult to get pushing westward.
Also occupied China's major ports. Japan had deployed 850,000 soldiers to carry out the conquest, and it could now start withdrawing them back to Japan to cut down the expense of the occupation. But the Chinese still had formidable forces. They decided to launch a major counteroffensive. Its goal was to retake Wuhan and to achieve smaller gains in several places. The offensive was launched in late 1939, but the Japanese strategy had proven to be effective. Without proper equipment, the Chinese were unable to breach the Japanese defenses. Nevertheless, they stopped an attack in South.
Have you seen the artillery you get as China? The first artillery. It looks like almost like a American Civil War with the big wooden wheel.
China, and disrupted the Japanese positions near Wuhan. The Japanese wanted to restore the security around Wuhan. They dispersed some Chinese units and then extended their territory to the west. The Japanese were able to recover from the Chinese offensive, but then the Chinese communists launched a series of attacks behind the Japanese lines known as the 100 Regiments Offensive. The Japanese...
Oh, that's a focus, isn't it? 100 Regiments Offensive?
Pressed the offensive.
I think it's something like 100 divisions something. It reduces training time.
In 19...
You never go for it because it's a waste of time.
41, they cleared their occupied areas from most of the communist forces and improved their defensive positions in North China. In central...
This region is really mountainous here. It's really difficult to get through in those Hoi 4 games. You almost have to like pin your troops against here and then push southwards.
China, they launched several offensives to weaken the Chinese forces. By this time, the Chinese had adapted themselves to Japanese tactics and avoided large-scale battles.
Got more doctrines.
And as a result, the Japanese could not completely destroy them. Japan had another problem. China had established land routes to the ports of the European colonial...
Oh, this is represented in Hoi... Sorry for the pausing, guys. This is represented in Hoi 4 as the, what they call it, road? Oh, I can't remember what it's called now. It lift something? The something lift? It's like a decision you can go for it for Britain. The Burma Road, and there's something lift as well from Vichy France.
...powers and was sourcing war materials from abroad. After France had been defeated in World War II...
You know what's actually funny is that in Hoi 4, even if you've got connection to the Burma Road and the Lidu Road, wherever it is, you still can't lend-lease. Like, if they've lost all their coastline, you still can't lend-lease. It's stupid.
Japan occupied the French Indochina and closed one of the routes. Remember that Japan could become...
So that's an incentive for Japan to push into Burma, isn't it? To cut off the other road that pushed into China to deny them war resources.
Embargoed by the United States. Well, the United States was opposed to Japanese expansion. The move into Indochina was the last straw, and the United States stopped selling oil to Japan unless it withdrew its...
Conquest of Korea. No, that's okay. Conquest of Manchuria. No, that's okay. Conquest of Inner Mongolia. That's okay. Conquest of Beijing. Conquest of much of northern China. Conquest of Vichy France. Indochina. That's too far. You just got too far there. Too far.
Forces from China and Indochina. Japan got almost all of its oil from the United States, and without the new source, its military would become inefficient in a couple of years. For Japan, withdrawing from China was unacceptable. It also realized that until the United
World tension too high.
States controlled its oil supply, it could make Japan do whatever it wanted. So Japan badly needed its own source of oil. For this, it could capture the oil fields from the European colonial powers. This would mean war with the United States, a country much more powerful than Japan, but the risk was considered worth it. To answer the question from the beginning of the video, Japan went into war with China, but China did not surrender. So Japan had to escalate the war more and more. Eventually, this caused the United States to embargo Japan, and the only acceptable way out of the situation for Japan was attacking the United States. Would Japan going to war with America finally turn the war in China's favor?
Find out on the next episode of Dragon Ball Z.
One which we hope to tell in a separate video.
Damn. That was actually really good because I don't know very much about the war in the East. I actually don't know a great deal about that, so that was actually fascinating for me.